All right. Thanks, everyone. So we're going to get going here. Welcome to Circular Action Alliance's webinar on the Colorado Needs Assessment. So for those who may be new to our organization and our webinars, we are CAA, the Nonprofit Producer Responsibility Organization that in May was last May was approved to implement Colorado's Extended Producer Responsibility, or EPR, law for packaging and paper items. CAA was founded in 2022 and is led by 20 companies that will have significant obligations under these laws and are working to support all producers, all those who will have obligations in meeting the requirements of laws across multiple states. I will note, although it's not the focus of this discussion, that CAA has also been approved to be the single PRO in California and is the single pro working to submit program plans required for approval in Oregon. We are not going to do a deep dive on what EPR is and does today because we have a lot of content to get through specific to the needs assessment, but we will give you a brief bit of background on Colorado's law and touch on the requirements and the opportunities to boost recycling and strengthen Colorado's circular economy through our analysis of the needs assessment findings. A few additional quick pieces of housekeeping before we jump in. We're going to present for roughly 45 minutes. We're going to do our very best to leave at least 15 minutes for Q&A at the end. We're going to go all the way through the presentation before taking questions to ensure that we get through it, and given the size of the audience. And then also given the size of the audience, we will be taking Q&A via the Q&A function. We will do our best to answer some questions in writing as we go and answer others verbally at the end. If you submit your question anonymously, we won't be able to follow up with you, but if you include your name with your question and we don't get to it, we will have an opportunity to follow up with you and answer any questions that we can't get to in today's session. I mentioned we are recording up into the Q&A. I also wanted to mention that if there are media on this call, that's fine. Everyone is welcome here. I would just ask that you save your questions and follow up with us after and let stakeholders ask their questions during the Q&A. So the email address for questions is media@circularaction.org. Next slide, please. Great, so we're not going to do detailed intros, but I'll quickly note that I am serving as the Communications and Recruitment, Producer Recruitment Director for CAA, and I'm joined by my colleague Pete Hargreave, who leads our work in Colorado, as well as Doug DeCesar from HDR. HDR was the consultant we partnered with to conduct the Colorado Needs Assessment, and Doug has been the team lead for this work. Next slide, please. All right, we've gone through the first two agenda items. As I'm going to quickly take you through the background on Colorado's EPR law and the purpose of the needs assessment before turning things over to my colleague Pete, who's going to do a deeper dive on what the needs assessment does compared to the program plan, and also do a quick review of the work has been done to date and what comes next before turning things over to Doug. Doug is going to walk us through how HDR approached the needs assessment and came up with over 100,000 data points on Colorado's current recycling system before going through the different elements the team studied, the key findings, and the opportunities presented by this new statewide recycling program to improve collection and recycling and circularity in Colorado. And as I said, we'll leave hopefully 15 minutes for questions at the end. Next slide, please. So if you're joining this webinar, you are likely aware that in 2022, the Colorado legislature passed an EPR law that requires producers, that's typically the brand owners of products that use packaging or paper, or the brand owners of paper products, to fund and manage a new statewide recycling program. Through this program, obligated companies will provide financial support for recycling programs and composting programs for compostable packaging, focusing on ensuring that recycling is as convenient as disposal and bringing new services to both municipalities and rural parts of the state. Colorado's EPR program is 100% funded by these producers, meaning the financial responsibility for end-of-life management of the covered material is on those companies that make the packaging decisions. This creates opportunities to incentivize packaging design choices that prioritize recyclability and other environmental considerations. The law explicitly prohibits the use of point of sale or point of collection fees, so there are no consumer-facing fees in this program. All obligated producers in Colorado must participate in the PRO unless they intend to submit individual compliance plans. Again, that it means participation with CAA, as we were selected in May of last year. And we will be working with all producers to ensure that they are meeting the requirements of the law, to collect packaging supply data, set fees, and allocate those fees to infrastructure improvements to further a variety of packaging and system performance objectives. So since we were selected last spring, we've been working through our initial responsibilities under the law, starting with the development of the needs assessment. And in the interest of time, I'm going to move to the next slide, which gives you a brief overview of the purpose of the needs assessment. So under Colorado's EPR law, the pro is required to complete a needs assessment and to hire a third-party consultant to do that. And that consultant is HDR, represented here by Doug, who also worked in partnership with Eunomia. And that needs assessment looks at the state's current recycling services and infrastructure to ensure that the plans we develop as the pro are based in a solid understanding of what is happening today, and to start to orient the pro around where we can fill gaps in service and processing capacity and other factors. Pete and Doug will go into more detail on the different elements studied, as they do go beyond just recycling and extend to composting infrastructure, reuse, end markets, and more. But essentially, the team was looking at how packaging materials flow through the system. So starting with what happens at the collection point, how they are managed at transfer stations and processed at MRFs, compost sites, and finally how those covered materials find their ways to end markets, whether those end markets are in-state or out of state. The primary purpose of the needs assessment is to understand, current performance and costs, and start to set some objectives around what improved performance could look like. And that's sort of, we'll talk about those different scenarios, but they're essentially cost scenarios associated with different performance objectives. And Colorado's law has a unique requirement of including the provision of 3 scenarios in the needs assessment, sort of a low, medium, and high scenario, which are a range of different targets and the costs associated with each that will essentially guide the program plan that the pro develops. And those scenarios, one of those scenarios will be chosen by the regulator, Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, CDPHE, as a recommendation to the Joint Budget Committee in the Colorado State Legislature, who will then approve the scenario for the program to move forward. And I would just flag here that, there's a lot of great information you're going to hear today that was gathered through the needs assessment process. And that information is certainly the basis for the program plan for managing the materials covered under Colorado's law, but it is not where the data collection and input stops. As we do the program planning over the course of the next year, there will be a need and multiple opportunities to gather additional data and seek input from a range of stakeholders. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Pete.
Thanks, Olivia. Just next slide over. So Olivia described sort of the purpose of the needs assessment, but I think it's equally important to explain how it differs from the next step of the process, which is really the development of the program plan. So as Olivia mentioned, the needs assessment describes sort of the baseline context. It establishes the potential for improved outcomes through the use of different types of mechanisms. In contrast, the program plan really gets into establishing how the PRO or CAA will transition the system to that sort of selected scenario that's chosen by the JBC. We have provided some examples on the slide, so in that table, that sort of speaks to the differing expectations in the legislation between what's required of the needs assessment versus what's required of the program plan. So in the needs assessment, as an example, we're describing how education is currently provided, the current gaps, the current gaps and considerations around how it could be improved. In the program plan, we are describing how the improvements will be made and implemented within the system. For materials, the needs assessment assesses and proposes a draft list of materials that should be or that could be recycled across the state, and what materials might be collected in certain regions or through certain outlets. The program plan really finalizes those lists and gets into the details of how they will actually be implemented. For targets and for reimbursement, it's a similar type of contrast. The needs assessment establishes baseline considerations and the program plan describes how things will be implemented. There's a couple of things that I think might be helpful to emphasize on this slide as well. The program plan process, which will follow, allows for flexibility. So there is the ability for adjustments that can be made as better information is obtained. So we know there are always going to be changes in marketplaces. There are always going to be changes or additional information that can be added. And so there is ability within the program plan to make amendments as that consultation process moves forward. And again, I think that consultation process is important. The program plan will require significant consultation in its development, which will happen over the next year after the JBC has made their decision on choosing a specific scenario. Next slide over. So the timeline has been fairly tight. We've had roughly 5 months to get the needs assessment completed. So that included a pretty extensive period, which Doug will speak to, around information gathering. So putting out surveys, doing webinars, interviews, in-person tours of different facilities within Colorado, and ongoing meetings and responses to the work done by the advisory board and the public. This was a pretty Herculean task, so it goes without saying, I think, in congratulations to the HDR and Eunomia team for what they've been able to accomplish in that short time span. From the beginning of this process, we did know that it would be a difficult timeline, and that is really why we worked ahead of time to move and to make sure the RFP was ready to be put out, and we awarded that contract ahead of schedule while still meeting the state's procurement code. We're confident on the work that's been done to date, and we do look forward as we move into that sort of phase 2 side as comments come back from the public through the public posting by CDPHE, and CDPHE has time to evaluate and provide comments back to us to look at potential adjustments that may need to be made before a decision is made by the Joint Budget Committee. Next slide over. So just briefly, the legislation required the needs assessment to address 14 distinct elements. So the legislation laid out within it the requirements for each of these elements. I'm not going to go through each of them specifically around the requirements. I'll just say, and I think as Doug gets into the information, we've tried to group these together based on similar types of factors within each one. So collection considerations, the demographics within the state and considerations on that side, processing, end markets, collection and how collection lists will be established, reuse, refill, education, compost, and then what all of those elements build upon is the creation of 3 different scenarios, recycling scenarios as to what the program could achieve by 2030 and by 2035 based on those scenarios. The team have been refining these elements based on feedback from the advisory board, from CDPHE, and from the public as part of the process over the last number of months. The full needs assessment has been posted on CDPHE's website, and there was a public comment period that was provided for 20 days, which ended on February 19th, so Monday this week. They are in the process right now, as I understand, of summarizing all the comments and identifying potential changes that may be necessary based on the comments received. Next slide over, and I think I will hand it over to Doug from HDR.
Thanks, Pete. So as Pete kind of alluded to in the project schedule and timeline, we had a lot of work to do in a very short period of time. And here you can kind of get a sense of the significant amount of outreach and research efforts that the project team did through the reaching out to the Colorado community as well as all the different stakeholders. And you can see we had 75, actually more than that, tours and interviews with service providers and end markets. 150 we reached out to, I think, around 270 different municipalities and entities, including counties. We received 150 surveys completed by those municipalities, 18 different advisory board meetings, 10 different state board meetings, and a lot of different conversations, comments received throughout the process. And as Olivia mentioned in her opening, all that effort and work resulted in more than 100,000 different data points regarding Colorado's existing recycling, composting services and system. And so those 100,000 different data points were utilized in developing some of the scenario options that are for consideration, as was mentioned before. Next slide. So as we kind of proceeded through the needs assessment at the very beginning, there was a focus on evaluating the existing system within the state based on 4 distinct geographic regions within Colorado. And those include the Western Slope, the Mountain Region, Front Range, and Eastern Plains. And these 4 regions were consistent with the 2016 Colorado Integrated Solid Waste and Materials Management Plan. And so those regions in that plan were based on the different socioeconomic and geographic factors. And that was important as we went through and identifying the service and accessibility disparities that exist between the different regions. And then that information was captured throughout each of the different elements that Pete went through, the 14 different elements. Next slide. So as Pete kind of described how we grouped some of the elements, elements 1, 2, and 5 were really focused around collections. And that's where we gathered information about recycling and waste services provided to those residential properties and non-residential covered entities, including service costs for the collection of those focused packaging and paper products. And what we found was about 90% of the households overall had curbside garbage collection. So based on the equivalency requirement, that would add another 500,000 different households that will receive curbside recycling in the municipalities. And in addition to that, another 100 to 200,000 households will also receive recycling services in other areas based on the new program. And then we also found that collection and hauling was much more difficult in the Western Slope region and the Mountain region, which really results in increased service costs compared to those costs in the Front Range region. And so it's anticipated that the producer funding through the statewide program will basically offset some of those higher costs and will also ensure the convenience of recycling services in those regions. And we found that servicing costs can range significantly throughout the state for recycling, and it's really ranges anywhere between $5 and $90 per household per month. And what really drives that big range is geographic and market conditions, along with whether or not you're bundling trash collection services with recycling. So what we did was really use the collection cost data from around the state to estimate the overall cost collections that producers would need to fund in those 4 different regions. Next slide. Element 3 was really focused on demographics. And what we really did was outline the demographic data in Colorado with taking into account environmental justice factors. And really this was to promote transparency and to provide informed decisions when creating the program plan. And this is really key for going into developing what that public education would look like through the program plan, where it's going to look at different languages and different socioeconomic differences in the state. And what we found was 77% of Colorado's landmass is considered rural. And in those rural areas, that houses 16% of Colorado's population, whereas 84% of Colorado's population resides mainly in the Front Range region that was shown on the map. We found that rural areas, and more specifically the Western Slope and Eastern Plains, exhibited higher poverty levels and had poorer health, whereas in the Front Range region, it had the highest EnviroScreen score, which means the Front Range communities are disproportionately affected by environmental health injustices. We also identified that 20% of the households in rural areas currently have curbside recycling services. And so it's anticipated underneath the new statewide recycling program that those services could be extended to 55% of those rural households that exist in those poorer parts of the state. And finally, what was also found was seasonal population fluctuations in the mountain region really make it difficult for recycling. So through the producer-funded programming and the use of a uniform list of recyclable materials, that funding will provide education not only for the residents, but also all the tourists that hits that region, and then also to try to make sure that the haulers are adequately equipped to manage those seasonal fluctuations. Next slide. Elements 4, 6, 7, and 10 were kind of really looking at the different processing capacity for both MRFs and composting facilities. And that's where we not only looked at the existing capacity, but we analyzed contamination rates as well as costs associated with processing the materials. What we found was most of the MRFs and the processing capacity lie within the Front Range region. The mountains and Western Slope have capacity, but it's relatively limited. And the Eastern Plains currently doesn't have any capacity. We determined that investments in the MRFs, the existing MRFs, would yield another 600,000 tons of additional capacity for commingled recycled materials on an annual basis, which actually represents about a 60% increase in what they could manage today. So essentially, the existing MRFs in the state could handle what's anticipated to come through the through the program, as long as there's some investments made. We found out that there are 3 new MRFs anticipated to come online in 2025, 2026, and all 3 of those are planned to be within the Front Range region. We identified that $49 million in capital upgrades are likely required to improve the existing compost facility infrastructure in order to process food waste and compostable packaging. And as the approved pro, CAA is definitely going to be required to help fill those infrastructure gaps regarding processing capacity. Next slide. Element 9 really looked at the different end markets and what is about. We evaluated what those end markets look like for those different materials, and then also what technologies could support collection and processing of the materials. And really what we found was the end markets for glass in Colorado are really strong, and that the existing infrastructure there could accommodate that anticipated increased volume generated by the new program. And there does exist other end markets within the state, but they're relatively small, and majority of those end markets are really outside the state of Colorado, which are stronger. And then also, what we anticipate is that the new statewide recycling program could generate an additional 400,000 tons of new material that could be circulated on an annual basis throughout the economy. And then also the total amount of material collected annually could exceed 700,000 tons. And then also, obviously, that would eliminate the use of some landfill airspace in the state. And to put it in perspective, that's kind of an equivalent of filling in Power Stadium, which is where the Denver Broncos football team plays on an annual basis. Next slide. Pete's going to kind of cover the minimum recyclables list that was created.
Perfect. Thanks, Doug. And I think, this element specifically sort of bulks together, I think, some of the findings from some of the elements that Doug has spoken about. So it takes into account, collection systems and what materials are being collected, It takes into account the processing capacity and infrastructure that's in Colorado, and it takes also into account then end markets. So as part of this element, we were required to evaluate a set of materials, the covered materials that are caught, to see what could be uniformly collected as part of what is termed the minimum recyclables list, and then which materials may be collected. And again, the additional materials list is really a list that has some more flexibility, so it can be collected more on a regional or within certain different outlets, collection outlets. So we developed a list of materials with the advisory board, and we looked at each of those materials and evaluated them based on what are the current recycling collection services that are available for those materials. What is the current collection infrastructure? So are those materials able to be and safely able to be collected within the state? What is the capacity currently in place, the MRF capacity to sort those materials into commodity outputs that would be sent to end markets? What are the end markets that are available for those materials? And then we did also look at detriments, so potentially areas where the packaging potentially could create issues within for worker safety, detriments potentially to other commodity bales that they might be bulked with. So we tried to take sort of more of a holistic approach as to what the impacts and opportunities there were to collect the materials based on the current Colorado recycling system. So each of those materials was assessed a score, and those scores were then used to evaluate whether they should be collected uniformly across the state, so curbside or depot equivalency. And in that case, they would be put on the minimum recyclables list, or whether there was potential issues or obstacles or barriers that may mean they can only be collected in certain locations. And again, in that case, they were added to the additional materials list. Next slide over. So again, the minimum recyclables list, just to be clear, is the list of materials that is collected in a manner that is as convenient as the collection of garbage is within the state. So the lists included on this diagram are subcategories of what we decided were paper, metal, glass, paper, metal, glass, rigid plastics, flexible plastics, and then a category that was sort of other materials, which would represent things like wood or textiles, other packaging potential materials that might be used in the marketplace. So this is the list of materials that or subcategories that were considered to have few, if any, barriers towards collection in the state, that are able to be sorted efficiently and effectively in the current MRF infrastructure, that had available end markets to take those materials, and that had little or no detriments associated with collecting those materials. And that's why those materials are again looked at as sitting on this minimum recyclables list. Next slide over. The next list is materials that may have some challenges with them, and so the additional materials list is a list of materials that may be collected in potentially different geographic areas where there may have better sorting infrastructure in place, where they may have better access for curbside services, or they may have the ability to be collected in drop-off sites in those regions. So there's more flexibility in how we choose to collect these materials as part of the program plan, but they do not need to necessarily be collected in a uniform manner across the state. So this material does include, as opposed to the other, it does include some additional materials. The last slide had included a large amount of paper packaging, a large amount of metal and glass packaging, some of the rigid plastics. This material adds in more different types of paper products that may have some, or packaging that may have some difficulties potentially associated with it. Some additional metal products that again may have some difficulty associated with it. It adds in more rigid types of packaging, and does as well add LDP, HDPE film. There are other materials that are not on either of the two of these lists. Those are materials that will still need additional work to be collected within the within Colorado's current recycling collection infrastructure. And so every year the Pro will need to reassess these lists and look at what materials may or could be potentially brought into these lists. The approach, the assessment that needs to be done for this on an annual basis will be the same every year. So it is looking at what the infrastructure that's in place and the ability for that infrastructure to be able to collect those materials efficiently and effectively. Next slide over.
So element 11 was really a focus on reuse and refill opportunities, and we conducted research to understand really the availability and scope of those systems in Colorado. And that was going to be used to develop insights into trends and opportunities for migration into those product delivery spaces. And what we found was there are 52 existing reuse refill programs operating in Colorado, with the vast majority of those located in the Front Range region. And really, reuse was not directly included in the scenario controls, but growth of reuse options was definitely taken into account when we estimated potential waste reduction in the state. In total, reuse combined with packaging lightweighting and other prevention efforts, we anticipate could reduce packaging generation by 5 to 10% within the first 10 years of the program. And finally, there are challenges to reuse and refill that would require investments necessary to develop the infrastructure, such as washing facilities. Next slide. Element 12 is where we focused on education. And what we really tried to do as a team was look at evaluating current recycling education programs in the state, as well as looking at those costs, and then identifying best practices and recommendations for recycling education that will eventually go into the program plan. We found that across the state, the spend on education for recycling varied significantly, anywhere between $1 to $26 per household per year. And after looking at those numbers and then understanding where it's kind of more successful in certain locations, it was recommended to basically bring all the households up to a minimum of $10 per household per year, which went into the modeling. We believe that a statewide minimum recyclables list, along with consistent education, is going to improve participation, reduce contamination at both recycling and composting facilities, as well as increase the recycling rate. And then we also felt like going forward in the program plan that recycling education should be tailored to the local geography, the different demographics, and also cover those more common recycling contaminants. And finally, it was important, I think, for the program implementation to take into consideration messaging and tactics associated with environmental justice communities. Next slide. And finally, before we go into element 13, which is like the outcome of everything and the scenario options, element 14 was focused on composting. And that's where we were looking at different capacity and feedstocks within the existing compost facilities in Colorado, determining whether they will accept compostable packaging and food serviceware, and any potential expansion for capacity. And what we found was that the facility and equipment upgrades that we actually ended up modeling varied for class 3 level composting facilities, and mainly class 3 because those are permitted to accept the compostable packaging that we're looking at in this plan. It was determined an estimated $49 million are needed to make the appropriate upgrades in order to accept the feedstock that we're looking at. And those were incorporated for by 2030 for each of the scenarios. We determined approximately 1/4 of the current processing capacity and potential capacity were associated with facilities currently accepting or at least willing to accept compostable packaging at the time of the surveys that we conducted. And finally, about 20% of that capacity is associated with the feedstock or generators that include compostable packaging products. And now Pete's going to go through element 13, or essentially the scenario options.
Perfect. Thanks, Doug. As Doug mentioned, so the scenarios really sort of summarize the work, all of the elements of the work into looking at 3 different potential scenarios around what could be achieved by 2030 and 2035. So we've included in the next 3 slides just an understanding of how we established the low, medium, and high scenario. And in each of these scenarios, we really looked at what are elements, what are controls that potentially can impact costs within the program, capital needs, and what can impact performance. And obviously, some of those elements are interdependent. And so this list really represents an assessment of what those factors are. And then we developed then a low, a medium, and a high scenario with feedback from the advisory committee to look at differing approaches to how those, I'll call them switches, could be changed throughout. So the first piece deals with controls around access. So residential access equivalent to trash. Now the legislation requires that it will be achieved by 2030. And so you will see that we have considered, obviously, that a program will meet that equivalency level so that every household within the state will have recycling services, whether they're single family or multifamily. We are also required within the legislation before 2030 to provide recycling for non-residential covered entities. So that includes parks, small businesses, hospitality, government buildings. And so we have included that as well. They need to be covered by 2030. But as you'll see under the note, there is an understanding that potentially participation rates may build over time. Those relationships may be more difficult to bring online. And so we have considerations around what the participation rates for each of the different scenarios are. We did look at the collection method, whether we should look at single stream or dual stream. Based on the current system in Colorado, it did not make sense for us to move forward with looking at dual stream because most of the systems in place are currently single stream facilities. And the indication we had from all of the service providers was that was the direction they were moving forward with in the future. We looked at frequency of collection of materials. And so under that category, we looked at no change weekly or bi-weekly. So in the low scenario, we have no change to existing service, bi-weekly for any new service that's been added. The medium scenario, a similar consideration. And then in the high scenario, we considered all collection would be weekly, transition to weekly, either if that is existing services or new services being provided. Efficiencies in collection routes, we looked at, how could we potentially, if the system was to drive more density in routes, how could that potentially improve efficiency in collections? So we looked at minor potential efficiency increases, medium and major, looking again at the density of those routes and cubing out trucks more quickly so that they can service more routes. Next slide over. We also looked at materials and how they could be collected as one of the factors. So retail or event-based collection of hard to recycle materials. And that's really looking at a lot of those materials is looking at materials like household hazardous packaging. So things like used oil containers, pressurized cylinders that are have specific considerations around how they are collected. In the low scenario, we considered no changes, and in the medium, the high, we considered event-based or periodic events that would be held to collect those materials. The minimum recyclables list is required to be implemented right away, so that is a standard right across the board. The additional materials list and moving it forward, we did look at some differences in the low and the medium scenario in 2035, and then the high scenario in 2030. For flexible plastics collection, we did look at different options around incorporating those materials in. As you remember, they really didn't have much in the way of collection within Colorado currently. So we're looking at really no changes on that side in the low scenario. In the medium scenario, drop-off servicing being provided by 2030 and curbside by 2035. And then in the high scenario, we consider drop-off and curbside by 2030. Glass collection and improvements around glass collection. We considered essentially keeping things as they are under the low scenario. Under the medium and the high scenario, we considered including glass in all curbside programs, but maintaining where drop-off makes sense and improving within the MRFs the glass cleanup systems so that we can improve yield rates for those materials. Next slide. We also looked at education. We did have discussions around potentially looking at different options for the level of education we would provide, but in the end, we decided to stick with what is considered best practice, which was $10 per household investment, and that was based on looking at work by groups like TRP and also looking at some of the best practices within Colorado and the municipalities that are investing in education. For drop-off sites, we looked at expansion and new sites. An expansion under the low scenario, expansion and new in the mountains, the eastern and the western slope. The same in the medium scenario, and under the high scenario, we considered expansion and new infrastructure, new drop-off sites in all of the regions. Compost facility upgrades. I think Doug mentioned this in his piece. We considered right across the board upgrades being provided by 2030, and that was the 49 million that he discussed. And then we also looked at waste prevention and material changes. So under increases due to population growth, we looked at and we applied it right across the board, which is increases in the population of 0.75 by between 2022 and 2025, because that gives us our baseline number. And then 25 to 2030, looking at those years with a 1.25 growth, and then 2030 to 2035 a 1.5% growth in population. We did also consider waste prevention. We do know there's a lot of activities happening not only in Colorado as part of this program, but also in other states. So we do anticipate these types of policies will lead to material lightweighting and reuse systems to be put in place. These are difficult to predict, but we did add the assumption that there would be a 5% decrease by 2030 and a 10% decrease by 2035. And that is based on obviously each household potentially generating slightly less materials over that time period. Next slide. So again, I think it's probably important to say, so we did model out the results. The models are obviously based on the certain milestones within the legislation. There are obviously on the ground operational considerations that might impact the implementation. Those were not taken into consideration. We just looked at what could be achieved if all the elements were implemented as we had set out. The below chart sort of sets out, as you look at the baseline moving forward to 2030-35, the improvements in the recycling rates. And in all cases, you're seeing at least a 10% increase over the baseline in 2030 and a doubling in all the circumstances of performance by 2035. You'll notice, I think, when you look both at the low, medium, and medium and high scenarios, the numbers are relatively similar, and that is partially because some of the key elements, key requirements of the legislation are mandated. So the fact that access needs to be provided equivalent to trash by early within the program, so before 2030, that means that is going to influence and impact the amount of materials that are being collected right across the state. So that is going to add an improvement itself. So some of those key factors around when residential homes will receive equivalent recycling service and when non-residential covered entities will receive recycling service does impact those numbers in a similar way across the low, the medium, and the high scenarios. The costs obviously outlined are costs that will be funded by the producers themselves. And there is a requirement within the legislation to consider the consumer cost impact in 2028 and then every 3 years thereafter. Next slide. So I'll try to zip through this last slide or a couple of slides quickly because I know there's a lot of questions. So again, I think the key findings, the current recycling rate for consumer packaging and paper products right now is between 22 and 28%. Under the new program, we'd look at potentially being able to improve that recycling rate by roughly double from where it is today by 2035. There would be an estimated 500,000 new households that would be receiving curbside recycling servicing. Currently, about 20% of households in rural areas have access to curbside recycling service. And under this program, that would see a lift to about 55%. Those that are not receiving curbside would obviously still have access to drop-off collection. Investments in material recovery facilities are estimated to yield about 600,000 tons in additional new capacity. The program, as Doug mentioned, would collect more than 400,000 tons of new material. And again, that would mean that 700,000 tons annually would be recycled within the state. So a large reduction in the amount of materials that would need to be landfilled. There are definitely some opportunities to expand end markets within the state. Doug mentioned glass already. There is a fairly good closed loop system potentially in place for that material. There are certainly other materials that offer opportunities as well, but I think certainly right now the glass markets are of a significant highlight. Next slide. So next steps, we have submitted the needs assessment findings to the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. I should have said that instead of saying CDPHE all the time, and apologies about that. So we have delivered that ahead of schedule. CDPHE has posted that, and we're receiving comments up until February 19th. They will evaluate and assess all of the feedback they receive, look for any changes potentially to the needs assessment, and present one recommended scenario to the Joint Budget Committee. And that committee is expected to meet on or before March the 15th and approve one of those scenarios, or potentially, if they do not approve the scenario that was recommended, they would look at an alternative that would need to be brought forward through legislation.
Thanks so much.
We'll
Pete.
stop there because I know there's lots of questions. So
Yep, we're going to have Sydney stop recording now, and we're going to jump into as many questions as we can. We're running a